Kia ora, I'm Liam from VOTE2023 and with me today is Holly. We are interviewing the Honourable Ingrid Leary from the Tertiary electorate and I figured we'd just get straight into it. Now, as an alumnus of our great institution, the University of Otago, what is a standout memory from your time here?
Great question, because there's lots of really good memories. Otago University is, of course, the best university in New Zealand. I went to Unicol, and before I arrived there, I had saved up with my part-time job teaching dancing to buy a stereo. I don't know if you've seen them, but you know, an old record player. And I had a corner bedroom on the 6th floor, and my door didn't lock. But I was the only one on my floor that actually had a sort of a music player. And I used to come home quite regularly to about 20 people sitting in my bedroom playing my records. So that's one of my best memories.
I'm sure we could ask tons of questions about your time in Unicol in particular, but we'll move on to Holly.
No, that's awesome. Given your advocacy experience, what do you think is the biggest challenge that women are facing in New Zealand today?
Oh, that's a really great question. Look, I'm really passionate about democracy and representation, and I think one thing we've got to be very careful about is not being complacent about the fact that we do have quite large numbers of women in Parliament. So we've reached 50%, and we've also for the first time reached 50% women in Cabinet. But as the tide changes, the political tide, it is usually women that lose their seats first, or are often not placed very high on party lists. So I think we've got to be very vigilant about that. I'm going to be looking really closely after the election to see what is the gender split in Parliament, because it has been diverse, it has been representative, but I'm not sure it's always going to be that way.
Yeah. And as Ambassador for Women in Parliament, what are your thoughts on the ACT Party's alternative budget, Time for Truth, where they pledge to abolish key cultural ministries, including the Ministry of Women?
I think it's part of that thing around complacency. It's no accident that in New Zealand we have strong women's representation. We've got world-leading women's representation actually, and that has been through voluntary party quotas as well as MMP. But there's also been lots of strides made, big strides, and more work to do about representation for other marginalised groups such as, say, Pacifica or other ethnic groups. The representation is done strategically and through a conscious movement, and those ministries help with the structural bias against minority groups. If we eliminate those ministries, then we take a massive step backwards around representation. I did hear the ACT Party Deputy Leader, Brooke Van Velden, talking about unconscious bias and saying she didn't think it was a problem because she hadn't experienced it. And I remember the interviewer saying, isn't that the point about the fact that it's unconscious? So for those who haven't experienced it, it may not seem important, but when you're in a marginalised group, it's really important that we have those safeguards, and that includes also the Human Rights Commission, which would be abolished under ACT.
Yeah, absolutely. And on Tuesday, the ODT reported that Labour were weighing in at just 24%. Now, this is the latest in a series of unfavourable polls towards Labour. So my question is, what do you think are the biggest factors causing this poor polling?
Sure. The first thing I'd say is that particular poll, if it was a taxpayers poll, that is a group that is known to be affiliated with right-wing parties. So the danger of polling is that it is supposed to be a reflection or a snapshot of where we are in a point of time, the mood. But actually, like journalism, polling has an influence and helps to shape people's thinking. I think the more accurate poll is the one that came out this morning, which would put us at 30%, which means that we are still lagging in the polls, and we do have to work really hard to win this election. What's the reasons? Well, first, I think it's early days in the campaign. Lots of people haven't made up their mind. We need to get out and have conversations, so on the doorsteps, on the phones. Those are the things that will win an election. The other thing I think is that there is a media narrative that has changed over time since my time as a journalist. I think the media is under enormous pressure to produce news very quickly and to do lots of different roles. So a journalist now is often, editing their story and posting online and so on. And so there's a tendency for the framing of the story to happen before a journalist goes out rather than with an open mind. I think that's a massive trend that we're seeing globally. I don't know what the answers are, but I would urge everybody to Make sure that they get multiple news sources. Don't just get your news online and don't get it just from one source. I do think Radio New Zealand's a really good source of news, but definitely the more voices in the media scape that you can listen to, the more informed that you're going to be and the less likely to fall prey to misinformation.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, how would you advise everyday Kiwis to tackle fake news? Like, obviously it's yes, reading multiple news sources, but what sort of simple advice could you give, particularly students who are inundated with social media on TikTok, on Instagram? How can we sort of filter through that noise?
So another really good question, because I think it involves critical thinking, and I would always say as a former journalist to triangulate your news sources, but in an era of AI even that is difficult because misinformation can be come at you from different sources. We do know, of course, that algorithms mean that people get into echo chambers. So again, it's about just diversity of what you read, what you consume, who you hang out with, where you travel to, just having a curious and open mind, and always thinking critically about why is something happening, because I think it's the why in news media that we're losing at the moment.
Awesome answer. I think we're on to the Vox Pops now.
Oh yes. We're going to just listen to some students from Otago about some big topics that we'd like to hear from you after.
Sure.
Kia ora, I'm Carlito and I'm here on Otago University's campus asking students about what do you think about the current state of tertiary education funding in New Zealand?
Ooh, tricky one.
Pretty bad.
Obviously, it's not ideal to have universities like Otago and Vic dropping, subject areas and stuff like that. At the same time, governments aren't made of money, I guess, but it's definitely a public good that needs to be preserved, and the government should step in to shoulder that burden sometimes.
Yeah, I'm not super stoked about the uni cuts. Would be pretty stoked for a universal student allowance.
It's a really important issue, and I feel it's quite absurd that a lot of students are living below the poverty line.
I think that tertiary education should be free in New Zealand.
Yeah, me too. And obviously we don't have enough money at Otago right now, so.
Yeah, stop the geology cuts. Do you think the government should be focusing on climate change more?
Yeah, obviously. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the next government should focus on climate change rather than developing the roads. Yeah, definitely, especially like we've got pretty high per capita carbon emissions, so I definitely feel like wider scale action on climate change would be really good, like public transport funding, for example.
Yes, I think it should be the focus of any government coming in. I think we're doing enough to meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Accord, but I don't think that's enough. I think we should be going further and trying to be a world leader.
Thank you to everyone who came out to be interviewed by us. So we heard on a diverse range of topics there, and I think to bring it to Dunedin, you have been a huge advocate yourself for adaptive solutions for South Dunedin in terms of coastal erosion. What role do you think local government plays in dealing with the climate crisis?
I think that we need to have a big scale of ambition around climate change adaptation. The opportunity that we have in South Dunedin is, instead of just relying on ratepayers to fund what could be possible, is to have local government and central government working together, create a pilot scheme where South Dunedin could be the pilot for the whole of New Zealand or even the world in terms of how we adapt to the sea level rise, but also the low water table, given that there are parts of the south that are going down rather than up. So there's a real opportunity there, and the role that Dunedin City Council has played, which has been really great, is they've done world-leading research, which means that we can get ahead of the curve. So we could invest into climate change adaptation rather than having to clean up a really big, expensive mess, which is what has happened up in the North Island. So this is a real key priority for me as a local MP. I know that there's a bid with Treasury at the moment. Apparently that's been leaked. I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but as long as I'm an MP and as long as I'm able to advocate, I will be advocating for that. I think it's a fantastic opportunity.
Do you sense, beyond the research capacity and more in a decision-making authority perspective, do you think local government is taking enough initiative on those projects?
Look, I think Dunedin City Council has been doing really good work. I wish that the timeframes had been shorter. We experienced a huge flood in 2015. It is now 2023 and there's been no visible change. A lot of the research has been going on behind the scenes. I would have liked that timeframe to be much quicker. I can't speak for councils around New Zealand, but I can tell you that with the events over the last year of Cyclone Gabrielle and so on, they've had a very big wake-up call. Excuse me.
So, noting the tertiary education funding being central to students for this election, noting Otago's $60 million budget black hole that we have, who is responsible for that? Is it the University of Otago or is it the government?
The first thing I'd say around tertiary funding, there's a couple of things actually. One is universities are incredibly important for thought leadership. They are so important in terms of taking evidence-based approaches to the big issues in life, such as climate change, or as we've seen with COVID. And certainly Otago University played a really key role, particularly around COVID. But secondly, it's really important that governments don't get involved with the day-to-day funding decisions of universities, because there's a temptation to stray into things that could be seen as political decisions. So it's very important to have that clear distinction and make sure that universities make their own funding decisions. So when it comes to who's responsible, I think that the university manages its own budget. Governments need to make sure that there is enough budget for universities, but that's in the totality of everything else that pulls on our funding, such as climate change, such as health and so on. But university is very important, and I'm very keen that every person that wants to have a tertiary education has the opportunity to do that regardless of their means.
Perfect. Do you think the butts in seats model, as it's so often called, accounts for a university as an intellectual institution, as we're seeing now with the geology department being cut because it is less popular than other departments? Do you think that the university is maintaining itself as an academic institution rather than more of a neoliberal business?
Look, I think there are really big decisions to be made about what principles do you apply for university funding. And those are decisions for universities to make. As I say, it's not up to politicians to stray into that. What I do really value though, and I think what is vulnerable are the arts, music, drama, the creative economy skills that are seen as the softer skills in society. And so there is a role for universities to make sure that they value those areas in thought leadership as much as the so-called productive areas, which may have an easier pathway through to careers. We've got to make sure that we match the skills that we are developing for work pathways, but we also need to keep thought leadership across all of the areas of human academia and intellect. And so that's a big job for people on probably higher pay scales than me, who are sitting in the university doing that thinking. Needs to be a principled approach. And I do think that the collaborations that we're seeing through, say, Otago University, Victoria University, and being able to get some economies of scale is probably a good idea. New Zealand's a small market, so we do have to be realistic about the size of the market as well.
Perfect. With noting both the discussion we've just had about climate change and the university, so the University of Otago has a sustainability office. It does a lot of fantastic work around climate change adaptation. What support, as far as you know, does the government provide for that sort of research?
There's lots of support in the science areas, and we've been very lucky that Honourable Dr. Aisha Verrill, who is also an alumni from Otago University, has been responsible for that funding. I know that she's really interested to see what are the principles applied to that, how can we get the most value out of the research, but also I think a really critical question is how can we ensure that there's creativity and curiosity and not expect that every single research project leads to a financial or economic outcome. There needs to be that scope to be able to have some failure, because that is what pushes thought leadership to the edges of human endeavour. So I know that that's very much on Dr. Aisha Verrill's mind, and if she has the privilege of being back in that position after the election, I think you'll see some interesting and exciting developments around how science funding is done.
Do you think that position is consistent with the government supporting so much research, and especially the university, do you think that is then consistent with, of course, cuts to major climate conscious fields such as geology and marine science?
Look, those again are questions for the university to make. How they carve up the pie is very much for the university to make, taking into account all of those things we've talked about: student numbers, where the needs are, the pathways to work, where the research opportunities are, and where the big issues are in society. And I don't envy them. Those are very difficult decisions to make, and so that's why I'll stick to politics and let them stick to academia.
Fair enough. We'll move back into politics then. So while National's tax policy has been hailed by many as a masterclass of political delivery, many in the Labour Party have been quite critical of it, and there's been a lot of news around it, surrounding some issues, and I was wondering if you could help us cut through the noise. What do you see as the main problems with the National's tax policy?
Oh, the number one problem is they're not costed, so they can't afford them. And that's an issue, because when you can't afford something, what it means is you've got to pay from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so traditionally, National has cut services to health and education, or in 2010, they actually raised GST from 12.5% to 15% to pay for a deficit, even though they said they weren't going to. So the question for us is, the tax cuts might look attractive, but they're not costed. The second issue is that they're regressive, which means that they advantage middle and higher income New Zealanders, and they give ordinary New Zealanders a very small tax rebate comparatively because of the size of the salaries. I'm interested in closing the inequality gap, not growing it, and what I see is that their tax cuts would actually grow the inequality gap.
I'm glad you mentioned GST. Of course, it's been a central issue. The Labour's proposed GST free for fruit and veg. A lot of students have felt a disconnect with the Labour Party, and they felt that this step is out of touch. While Labour's proposed under 30s free basic dentistry is definitely a step in the right direction, what do you think your party is doing going into this election to appeal more to younger people and students?
Well, I think the first thing is that I know what's on young people's minds, what young people have told me, is climate change and mental health. And the left-leaning parties are the only parties, in my view, that take climate change seriously. With the National Party, we hear a lot of lip service, but they've actually voted against every proposal that we've introduced, apart from the carbon zero legislation. With ACT, I don't even hear lip service. So if I was a young person, I'd be deeply worried about what those right-hand parties would do for climate change. When it comes to mental health, this government has invested heavily into mental health, but I think that the wellbeing approach in the budget is actually a really important part of it as well, because it's not just about being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's how do we avoid getting young people into situations where they're feeling so much crisis, and that comes down to poverty, it comes down to climate action, it comes down to social justice, and so many other issues. And so taking an approach to budgets where we look at wellbeing as an approach rather than just say GDP, which is the traditional right-hand side of politics does, I think is really important, because it means we're looking at money as a means, or the way we carve up resources as a means to a flourishing human experience, versus just saying, you're a widget in an economy, what are you going to do to be productive? I think it dehumanises people taking that approach.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Those were all fantastic answers. I know we gave you some tough questions there. We really appreciate your time today. Now we're going to go over to Carly and Sophie with the top candidate for Dunedin, Dr. Penn Peters.
Kia ora, and welcome back to Vote 2023. I'm Carlito, and this is Sophie Boma. Today we are joined with Dr. Ben Peters, the Dunedin candidate for the Opportunities Party, or TOP. Ben is currently a professional practice fellow at Otago University, where he completed his PhD on microbiology and biochemistry. Molecular biology?
We'll go biochemistry.
I'm a politics student, that makes sense. Ben's desire to mix his scientific expertise with his commitment to helping people has determined his election priorities to be that of gene editing, climate change, and tertiary education funding. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben.
Thank you for having me here.
Now, Ben, with an extensive background in the sciences, what made you decide to join politics?
Yeah, so in science, we love to push boundaries. And I found that in the process of going through my PhD, we came into a pretty firm wall in New Zealand around using genetic technologies. And that was quite challenging because we knew that we could do a lot of good with them. And we've seen even in recent times how much good has happened in that area. Things like new medicines coming out, crop improvement, stuff like that. But New Zealand was being left behind because we have a regulatory structure that was quite restrictive. So that really made me look at who was setting the rules and ask the question of could they be different so we could have a more innovative society. That got me in touch with the Opportunities Party because they were really keen on that kind of approach to solving problems. And from there I developed some policy with them around gene editing that led me to being a candidate in 2020 and again in 2023 with the hope to bring some change there. And along the way I really fell in love with TOP's outlook on how we can create a fairer society, because I think we really do have a distortion in New Zealand's economy that is really deeply unfair, where people with land, with houses, are massively advantaged compared to those without. And so that was really, those two things coming together put me firmly in TOP's hands.
Yeah, so TOP is a relatively young party, and as a result, some of our viewers might be unfamiliar with who you are. Can you describe TOP in a phrase, and then just to make it harder, 3 adjectives?
Sure. In a phrase, TOP is a new party that is looking to bring a fresh voice to Parliament in 2023. We are a courageous party. We're willing to push the boundaries and introduce new legislation that's quite challenging for typical parties to engage with. And we really are focused around reforming our economy to move away from a housing economy into one that really rewards work. 3 adjectives, I would have to give you: courage, unity, and fairness.
As succinctly as possible, what are your top 3 policies?
Top 3 policies nationwide is definitely around a tax switch. So we want to start with a tax savings, so introducing a $15,000 tax-free threshold, a shift in the tax brackets so that they can keep up with inflation. We want to do a switch, so we want to bring in a land value tax to offset the tax savings from income, so we can put more of that tax burden onto land. And then also we want to help people support. So we want to put in wipe MSD debt and also bring in a big package, a financial package to help out disabled peoples as well. So that's our tax policy. It's definitely front and centre. We've got the Teal card, which is looking at supporting under 30s and really investing in our future generation. So that means free dental care, free GP visits, universal health care for under 30s. It also means $1,500 towards e-bikes, e-scooters, something like that, to really drive that modal shift and really help with climate change for our young people. It also means a $5,000 savings boost packaged up with a civics education. So we want to really give young people an opportunity to thrive in New Zealand because we have a real issue where we're not investing in them. And if we don't invest in our future, we're going to end up in a very bad place. So that's
Of course, that makes sense. And of course, just going back to the Teal Card policy and your investment in young people, why is that policy just for people under 30s? Why not make it universally available to people of all ages in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to get there, right? Yeah. But there is a practicality on how much we can afford to spend at once, particularly with the current economic climate. So looking at things like, particularly around healthcare, extending that out to 30, or especially around dental. Those years post-18 and into your 30s, there's a lot of stuff that happens around developing those good hygiene practices, and then you enter a fairly low maintenance span for a fair while before you then start hitting your much later years where dental gets expensive again. So for something like dental, it makes a lot of sense to target that young area. I know for myself, I had a dental checkup at 18, and then my next one was at 24. You run out of free dental, you go, yeah, they told me I just need to floss more every time. And so really being able to have that habit come in there. It also covers then your wisdom teeth coming in, that normally hits around 21. So there's really quite a sensible mode there, particularly with thinking about e-bikes, e-scooters. If we introduce it at 30 now, it means that everyone from now onwards will go through that time period. So it does actually help everybody in the future generation. So we're starting the investment now, but most people, you get born and then you become 30 and you carry on. So it will capture a really wide range of people in New Zealand. But for people who are already over 30, then you've got to cut it somewhere.
There's also an attachment of a national civic service program for getting the Teal program. How does that work?
So we really want to make sure people are leaving school well equipped to deal with the variety of life's challenges. And so what we saw as an opportunity to bundle up the $5,000 savings boost with the idea of doing a civics course. And so that can be delivered in a range of ways. It could be delivered on marae to get into different communities. It could be delivered by different community facilitators. Things like being able to go through first aid courses, driving courses, being able to just be a more aware member of society and being able to really contribute to New Zealand more. So that's what we're hoping we can do with something like a civics course. I think people like Outward Bound are pretty keen on that.
Sounds great, thank you for that. Now we're going to hear from students on the Otago campus on their thoughts on some big issues that we'd like to hear from you about.
Absolutely.
Kia ora, I'm Carlito and I'm here on Otago University's campus asking students about how do you feel about wealth tax in New Zealand?
I think there should definitely be a wealth tax and there isn't enough at the moment. Tax the rich.
Yes, tax more.
Oh, I think it'd be probably quite good.
Huge fan, to be honest.
I don't know too much about it, but I agree with the principles of it because I believe that there's too much wealth in the rich people in New Zealand.
Lots of people might struggle to pay a wealth tax if they're not super cash rich. They've got more assets, but at the same time, I think it makes way more sense than a lot of other taxes.
How do you feel about New Zealand's current tax brackets?
I think that we could tax the rich more.
Yeah.
I think they need updating. Yeah, I don't know, changing with the times.
I think they are far too nice, to be polite. All the tax cuts that I'm hearing are focused on the wealthier and middle income earners, when a lot more focus needs to be on the lower income earners in New Zealand.
How important do you think farming is in New Zealand?
Ooh, quite important, as it's one of our main industries. But I think it could be done better.
That's a very, I have lots of different opinions about that. I think it's pretty important. It needs to move with the times. Well, I guess it's what a lot of New Zealand, the economy is based on at the moment. We need to be thinking about farming in rural communities and politics, I guess.
Quite important, I think. Like New Zealand gaining an edge in terms of lots of farming technology and stuff like that has kind of made our economy, our farming economy specifically, quite successful, and it's quite important to us, just as a country.
It's not an environmental practice right now.
Yeah.
It's at complete odds to what we need to be doing to stop climate change.
I think gene editing is quite a powerful tool that lots of people are scared of because I guess New Zealand doesn't allow GMOs.
Genetic modification isn't an issue that scares me. I'm happy to eat genetically modified foods. It's not really something that concerns me.
I think it could prevent a crisis later down the track, but it would have to be very controlled, and I know how I'd feel about eating something pretty artificial.
If gene editing helps us to be more sustainable with our practices for farming, then I would support it for sure.
Don't know loads about it, to be honest. If it helps ease supply chains and can keep a price of a head of lettuce down from $6, then I'm probably hugely for it.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have some more information out there.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a lot of checks and balances as you're going through it to make sure that things don't cause problems.
So TOP have argued for empowering farmers to be biodiversity champions. This involves rewarding landowners for biodiversity, carbon sequestration and other environmental gains by creating a natural capital economy. What will this really entail?
So it will entail a system of biodiversity credits where farmers who are doing really well with that can then build up their credits, and they can be the money generated through that system also gets reinvested back into farms. I think it's really important that when we look at farming, we look at the ecosystems that they have. There is an enormous range of farms in New Zealand, and we can do better in some areas, and some areas are doing really well. There's a lot of areas around riparian planting on riverbanks and things like that, which are incredibly useful, incredibly valuable to keep our riverways clean, as well as being really good sources of biodiversity. Those areas we need to make sure we're rewarding to continue those good practices, and we have to recognise the importance that agriculture has on our economy as a whole. And so also as part of that, we want to avoid the situation which is happening at the moment where through the ETS we have a huge number of pine plantations coming in, which is not good for our environment overall, but is benefited in the current system. So we want to exclude things like new pine plantations from being part of the ETS as well, to make sure that the actions we are taking to address climate change are sustainable and good for our long-term overall view of New Zealand.
Are you confident that there are people actually willing to invest money if they don't see personal dividends?
Yep. So, I mean, it depends on what we quite mean by that. So I think farmers are incredibly invested in doing things that have long-term benefit to them and to their land. because it's their land at the end of the day that needs to continue to turn a profit for them. So they need to make sure that their land is continuing to be a healthy ecosystem. And so what we see, especially with New Zealand-owned farms, is that farmers put a lot into their own farms to ensure that they can continue farming for future generations. I think the cultural practice we have of handing farms down through generations is really strong in New Zealand, and I think that's what gives people a good confidence that they will try and do the best that they can. We need the right incentives and the right structure around that to make sure that that can happen.
Yeah, and earlier you touched on the emissions trading schemes and perhaps the interrelationship with the economy.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Christopher Luxon and the National Party's proposed use of the emissions trading schemes to fund their tax cuts?
Yeah, I don't think it's the best use for that. I think really when we're talking about the emissions trading scheme, it hasn't been done particularly well at the moment, and like I mentioned, there's perverse incentives around trying to find systems that game it, so particularly on pine plantations. I don't have many personal opinions of Christopher Luxon myself. I haven't met him yet, but we will see how that goes. So yeah, I think we have a part of the ETS does go into a dividend as part of our proposal, but that's only a small part of it. Really, we need to be investing that back into the system, so we're investing back into generating renewable energy sources and things like that. And because when we look at where most of our growth of emissions is coming from, it's coming from transport and energy sector. So they're the areas where we need to clamp down on our emissions the quickest, because they're the ones that are getting worse over time. Agriculture is fairly flat at the moment. It makes up a big portion, but it's a fairly flat portion. So thinking about ways where we can help that to continue to decline, because it has been slightly declining over time.
Yeah, and when you are referring to those systems that you want to focus on and your party wants to focus on, you are referring to their transport and energy systems specifically?
Yep, yeah. So we want to, with the ETS, we want to invest back into, particularly into renewable energies. As we electrify more and more of New Zealand, we're going to have high energy demands. So electrify New Zealand, things like one of our policies is to get the bus fleet, the national bus fleet, electrified 5 years earlier than currently projected. That will have an energy demand, and so I think it's important that we make sure we have an energy system that can make up for that. We've had some pretty rough winters with shortages of energy demand, or shortage of energy recently, and I think when that happens, that has a massive impact on people's cost of living as well. So ensuring we have enough capacity, and particularly in renewable energies, also means that we end up with people that have more ability to live in a decent way.
So TOPS Phase 1 of the fair tax system has proposed a tax-free threshold of $15,000. What benefit do you believe this will bring to students?
Yeah, so student allowance is taxed, as far as I'm aware, so that means that your student allowance would no longer be taxed, because it'd be your first $15,000. That's approximately a $1,500 increase annually on what you would take home there. It also means that if you're doing part-time work and if you're topping up your student allowance, which most people are, it's very hard to get through a degree without doing part-time work, and I know I did a substantial amount myself. So that will be quite a significant benefit to the income of students there.
And Phase 2 proposes two interesting details. Firstly, that TOP would provide a $16,500 basic income for ages 18 to 65, and a flat tax of 35%. Would you like to speak on that and what it would mean for students especially, or younger people?
Oh, absolutely. So universal basic income is a great idea around just giving out a flat amount of money to everybody. So like you have a student allowance, potentially, I'd qualify for some of it, you get that into your account every week, and then you can do things with it. It's a little bit perverse in New Zealand. We only get it if you're a student, and there's really strict criteria around that allowance, and lots of people fall afoul of getting it. I know I didn't qualify for my student allowance in my fourth year. After I'd been married, I got a letter from the IRD saying that my marriage wasn't valid for the purpose of StudyLink, because they have odd criteria about how much it's your parents' income, your partner's income, that kind of stuff. So doing a universal basic income removes a lot of that weirdness around the government messing with your relationships. It means that you're allowed to earn more as well. So students aren't allowed to earn over, I think it's about $280 a week before they start taking that away, and they take that away at dollar for dollar. And so that has really perverse incentives. I know I had to turn down work because it would put me over the limit, and then I would just have to be giving money straight back to the government. And so it's those kind of problems which it solves really well. And when you include it with a flat tax, it ends up being incredibly progressive. So you can see that when you have 16,000 going directly to the person, the effective marginal tax rate gives a beautiful curve that goes up the higher that you earn, because you end up quite flat at the top there. So it simplifies the tax system. It makes it very hard to avoid tax because you end up having one tax rate across everything. And so that makes it a very simple tax system, very straightforward, as well as being incredibly progressive and not punishing people for having a relationship.
So obviously, as a student-run team, we need to ask you about tertiary education.
Yeah.
Universities are facing terrible deficits where they're having to cut programs and teaching personnel, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yep.
If Top made it into Parliament,
I'll try not to cry.
what would you do to help the tertiary sector?
Yeah, so we are very focused on being collaborative when we make it to Parliament. So we need to work across both major parties in order to get the funding right. And this isn't just the University of Otago, this is universities up and down New Zealand. It's also our polytechnic sector, which has undergone a massive reshift, becoming Te Pekina. So we would look at working collaboratively to see how we can get a funding model that actually works, because both polytechnics and universities have been underfunded quite chronically. When COVID hit, for universities, that really was the tipping point, as that's how we've hit these massive deficits and we haven't been able to recover. With the Polytechnic, the massive reshuffle as well really brought that to light. Previously, before that, they still had lots of deficits and were getting government bailouts. So we can't keep going bailout to bailout. We have to work with the parties to figure out a proper way that we can fund these long term. Because tertiary education is so much more than just turning up to uni for a couple of years. It really helps the whole of society.
Yeah, and as a biochemist, we just want to move on to perhaps an interest
Enzymes?
of yours.
No.
Gene editing?
Gene editing, we'll go
that
with gene
rings
editing.
a bell.
Yeah.
We know that your party perhaps is interested in the focus of the legislation surrounding gene editing. Could you please explain to us what your party would focus on when it comes to gene modification?
Yeah, so our current legislation focuses on the time at which a particular technology was invented, and then that determines whether we can or can't use it.
Yeah.
It doesn't really look at the impact of the change. So you can use chemical mutagenesis, it creates lots and lots of random change, and that's allowed. If you go in with really precise technology, stuff that's come out in the last couple of years, because that's recent, it's not allowed, even though the overall change was a lot smaller. So what we want to see in that space is shifting away from going, well, that old technology is allowed, new technology isn't, and start asking the question, what change have you made to this particular organism? So maybe you've made a tomato that's a different colour. And you go, okay, that's a pretty minor tweak. It's just taking a little bit of this colour gene from over here and putting it in this plant here. And if it's same plant, maybe even one tomato variety to another tomato variety, very small change, that should be allowed. Bigger changes we would still regulate in the same way. So if you're taking genes from fish or something, putting them in tomatoes, that's when we'd start going, okay, that goes through the usual process that it is now, which is broadly that you can apply for permission to release it, but it normally gets declined. So we would like to see that streamlined, putting in a tiered system based on the risk of the organism itself, not the technology that was used to make it.
Gotcha.
Co-governance has been a very hotly contested issue in the media recently. There's actually very little mention about te tiriti or Maori Advocacy on your website. So what actually is TOP's stance on the matter?
Sure, so I think there's three things there. Number one is te tiriti, and that is that we do agree that it's a founding document for New Zealand, so that's really core and central. The second part there is around co-governance, and co-governance is really important, but it needs to be done at a local level. So it's really important that we have co-governance between the mana whenua of that particular region with the regional councils that are dealing with that. So that, just because it is very difficult to then, it's a very different conversation at the national level in terms of how you get just two parties involved there. We have a huge variety of iwi, we have a huge variety in how that could look in partnership, but it is something that does happen, and I think we're broadly supportive of that. And in terms of Maori Advocacy as well, I think that's part of TOP's approach is generally being collaborative, and I think New Zealand is well served with a variety of parties that can all bring their particular flavour into Parliament, and so then we're able to work collaboratively in that space.
Yeah, and we know that the Greens have released their policy on Maori advocacy. In the general terms, what separates the Opportunities Party from the Green Party?
Yeah, so I think probably one of the biggest separators is that we want to work collaboratively with either Labour or National. And what that means is, regardless of the government of the day, we're able to have quite a big impact. The Green Party is staunchly opposed to working with National, which means that when you have a national government, you're not going to have as much input into that space. And it also means that we can then get a lot more done. If we're willing to negotiate with both sides, then there's a lot more leverage to work with there. And so I think that's probably the biggest separator.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ben, and thank you also to our dedicated production studio team and of course our viewers. We'll be back next week with more thought-provoking content very soon. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next week.